The dealership quoted $300,000 to restore it. A single dad did it in 11 days for $900, 47 specialists. That is the number of certified restoration experts the Hargrove Group contacted before they made the call. 47 men with wall plaques and insurance riders and shop floors that looked like operating theaters, and every single one of them said the same thing. The 1967 Shelby GT500 sitting in Bay 6 of the Hargrove Estate garage was beyond practical restoration. The lead appraiser from Meridian Classic Works put a number on it anyway. $300,000. Minimum. 18 months. No guarantees on the original block. They said it in the tone men use when they want you to feel lucky they're even bothering. Then a man named Mason Holt walked into that garage. Worn canvas jacket. Oil under his nails that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. Behind him, a 6-year-old girl in rain boots, holding a small stuffed rabbit with one ear longer than the other. Her name was June. The rabbit's name was Cog. The estate manager laughed, not loudly, but he laughed. 11 days later, that engine turned over for the first time in 19 years. Total parts cost $912. Stay with this one. It earns it. The Hargrove Group occupied the top 2 floors of a glass building in the financial district, but it was the estate. 40 acres outside the city, with a converted carriage house that held 11 vehicles, where the real business happened. Catherine Hargrove had been running the company for 14 months. She had inherited it from her father, who had built it from a regional trucking operation into a diversified holdings firm with 312 employees across 4 states. She was 31 years old. The board had been skeptical from the first week. She knew it. She had decided the only way to handle that skepticism was to never be wrong about anything important. The Shelby had been her father's. He had bought it at 19, driven it across the country twice. The third time he tried, outside of Flagstaff, the engine seized. He had it trucked home and parked it in Bay 6. That was 19 years ago. He had died 8 months before Catherine took over, and in those 8 months, the car had sat untouched, covered in a tarpaulin, while the estate waited for someone to decide what to do with it. Catherine had decided. She wanted it restored. She wanted it running on the anniversary of her father's death, which was 11 weeks away. She had contacted every specialist the company's network could surface. 47 of them. The best among them was a firm called Meridian Classic Works, based out of Nashville, run by a man named Oliver Vance. Oliver Vance wore a watch that cost more than most people's cars. He spoke slowly, with the cadence of someone who had long ago decided that his time was more valuable than yours. He walked through the carriage house with a flashlight and a clipboard, and he said very little for the first 20 minutes. Then he stood at the front of the Shelby and delivered his assessment the way a doctor delivers a terminal prognosis. The original block was seized at the crank. The carburetor was corroded beyond viability. The fuel lines had degraded. The wiring harness had been partially eaten by rodents at some point in the previous decade. The body showed surface rust along the lower quarters, but the frame was sound. The interior was original, and in remarkable condition, which was the only good news. He could do it. His team could have it running within 18 months. The cost, including parts sourced from period-correct suppliers, labor, transportation, and storage during restoration, would be somewhere between $280,000 and $320,000. He wrote the number on a single sheet of paper and handed it to Catherine with both hands, the way people hand over documents they expect to be framed. Catherine looked at the number. She did not flinch. She thanked him for his time. Oliver Vance was almost at the door when he turned back. He said that she should be careful about who she let touch it in the meantime. A car like that in the wrong hands could be damaged beyond recovery in an afternoon. He was saying it to be helpful, he said. He left. The estate manager, a man named Carter Briggs, watched him go with his hands clasped behind his back. Carter had been with the Hargrove estate for 11 years. He had a particular gift for making his opinions felt without ever stating them directly. He told Catherine that he had taken the liberty of compiling a list of local mechanics who sometimes did side work on classics, just in case she wanted a second opinion, he said. Not that he expected any of them to match Meridian's assessment. Just due diligence. Catherine told him to make the calls. Mason Holt was 32 years old, and he lived in a duplex 12 minutes from the estate, in a neighborhood where the lawns were small and the porches were close together, and people knew their neighbors' work schedules without asking. He drove a 2004 Ford pickup that he had rebuilt himself 3 times over. The odometer had stopped being accurate somewhere around the second rebuild. He had been working at a municipal maintenance yard for the past 2 years. Before that, he had done 6 years at Kellerman Aerospace as a senior propulsion systems engineer. Before that, he had spent 4 years with the United States Marine Corps, attached to a special operations unit that worked primarily in equipment recovery and field repair under austere conditions. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from Georgia Tech. He had a second degree, a master's, that he had finished at night over 3 years while working at Kellerman. He had left Kellerman 14 months ago. The reasons were his own. He did not discuss them with most people. What he did discuss with June was almost everything else. On the drive to school, he explained how traffic lights worked, how the road was paved in layers, how the engine in the truck was converting small explosions into forward motion 1 stroke at a time. June absorbed these explanations in the way she absorbed most things, quietly, thoroughly, and then later, she would say something that proved she had been listening more carefully than any adult Mason had encountered in a professional setting. He did not talk down to her. He had not talked down to her since she was 3, when he had noticed that she stopped listening when he simplified things too much. She was Renata's daughter in that way. Renata had always known when you were managing her instead of trusting her. So had June. The duplex had a kitchen that faced the backyard. June's drawings covered the refrigerator in overlapping layers, the newer ones partially obscuring the older ones, so that if you peeled them back, you could track the last 2 years of her imagination in sequence. Cog the rabbit lived on the kitchen table when June was at school, and in June's arms when she wasn't. One ear was longer because June had pulled it repeatedly since she was 4. The stitching on the shorter ear had been redone twice. Mason had done it both times, with the same thick thread he used for canvas repairs, and it had held. June's mother had died 22 months ago, a car accident on a rain-slicked highway at 7:15 in the evening on a Tuesday in October. Her name had been Renata. She had been 30 years old. She had laughed at things, Mason said, that weren't that funny. And she had kept a sketchbook on the nightstand, and she had been teaching herself Portuguese, because she said she wanted to take June to Brazil before she turned 10. The sketchbook was still on the nightstand. Mason had not moved it. There was a morning routine that had taken 4 months to build, and that Mason did not deviate from because June needed it, and because, if he was honest, he needed it too. 6:15. Up first, coffee, lunches packed. 6:40. June's room, the light from the hallway, not the overhead, because she woke better without the shock of bright. 6:45. Breakfast, usually eggs, sometimes cereal if the morning had gotten complicated. 7:10. Shoes. The shoelaces were still a negotiation. June was learning, and most mornings she tied them herself. And on the mornings she couldn't quite get the second knot to hold, she brought the shoe to Mason without asking, and he tied it without comment, and she went back to whatever she had been doing. 7:25. Out the door. Cog always made the trip to school inside June's backpack because of the teacher's rule, and June always retrieved Cog the moment she reached the truck in the afternoon, and Cog went on the dashboard for the ride home, on the days that were good, and in June's arms for the days that weren't. He found out about the Hargrove job on a Thursday afternoon. Carter Briggs had called the maintenance yard and asked if anyone on staff did private, mechanical work. The yard supervisor, a man named Elijah Tate, who had known Mason for 6 years, had given Briggs Mason's number without telling Mason first. Mason called back that evening after June was in bed. Cog had fallen off the mattress, and he had put it back before closing her door. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and he listened while Briggs described the vehicle. A 1967 Shelby GT 500. Seized engine. 19 years dormant. They had already received one quote of $300,000. Mason asked 2 questions. He asked about the block, whether anyone had confirmed it was the original. Briggs said Meridian believed it was, based on the stamped numbers. Mason asked whether the carburetor had been identified as a specific unit or just assessed as corroded. Briggs said he didn't know. Mason said he would come take a look. Briggs told him the estate manager would need to be present. He said it in a way that made clear he did not expect much from this particular visit. Mason said that was fine. He asked if he could bring his daughter. Briggs paused, then said that would be acceptable, provided she didn't touch anything. Mason said she wouldn't. The carriage house smelled of old oil and dry wood and something faintly metallic that Mason identified within his first breath as long-dormant coolant residue. He stood in the doorway for a moment before he moved. June was beside him, her hand in his, Cog tucked under her other arm. Carter Briggs stood near the wall with his arms crossed, wearing a jacket that had no practical function in a garage. There were 2 other men present, estate workers who said nothing, and whose job appeared to be witnessing. Mason walked to Bay 6. He removed the tarpaulin himself, folding it in thirds before setting it aside. He looked at the car for a long time without speaking. It was a fastback, original Brittany blue, the paint oxidized but not deeply degraded. The chrome had surface pitting, but the underlying metal was intact. He crouched down and looked at the lower quarters. The rust was what Meridian had described, surface manageable. He stood and opened the hood. June was looking at the car, with the serious expression she used when she was trying to understand something. She had placed Cog on a wooden stool near the wall, which was the closest thing to a safe surface in the building. She watched her father the way she always watched him when he was working. Quietly, with full attention. Carter Briggs said something about the carburetor. Mason did not respond immediately. He was looking at the engine. Not the carburetor. He was looking at the crank pulley, at the harmonic balancer, at the way the seized block had settled. He ran one hand along the top of the block very slowly, not searching for anything specific, the way you might run your hand along a wall in the dark to understand a room. He asked for a flashlight. One of the estate workers produced one. Mason shone it into the valley of the block, then along the timing cover, then down along the passenger side bank of the engine. He stood up. He put the flashlight on the fender lip. Carter Briggs asked him what he thought. Mason said the block wasn't cracked. He said the carburetor was a Holley 652, not the original 715, which meant it had been swapped at some point, and the original might be somewhere in the building. He said the seizure was at the crank, as Meridian had said, but it was a dry seizure, not a spun bearing, which was a different problem with a different solution. He said the wiring harness damage was localized to a section near the firewall, and was not systemic. Briggs asked him what that meant. Mason said it meant the car could be running in under 2 weeks. He said parts would run under $1,000 if they sourced from the right places, which he knew. He said the labor cost would be whatever Catherine Hargrove thought his time was worth. The silence in the carriage house was not the silence of nothing happening. Carter Briggs said that Catherine Hargrove did not typically make decisions based on assessments from municipal maintenance workers. Mason looked at him. He said nothing. Briggs said the car represented a significant emotional investment for the Hargrove family. He said that the risk of further damage was not something Miss Hargrove would take lightly. He said, in the particular tone that certain people have perfected, that Mason should perhaps understand the environment he was in. Mason picked up Cog from the stool and handed it to June. She tucked it back under her arm. He said he understood the environment fine. He said he would leave his number in case Catherine wanted to talk. He folded his jacket collar up, and he walked out of the carriage house with his daughter beside him. June, at the top of the gravel drive, asked if the car was sick. Mason said yes. June said Cog got sick once. She said she had stayed up with him. Mason said he remembered. Catherine Hargrove did not hear about Mason Holt that evening. She heard about him the following morning from her personal assistant, a woman named Grace Arden, who had been with the company for 9 years, and who had the particular quality of noticing things before anyone told her to. Grace had been in the building when Briggs made the calls to the maintenance yard. She had heard his half of the conversation. She had also, through the informal channels that exist in every organization, heard about what happened in the carriage house. She brought Catherine a coffee and a printed sheet. The sheet had Mason Holt's name, his employment history, which Grace had compiled from public records in 40 minutes, and a single line at the bottom that she had underlined. Twice, Georgia Tech, Mechanical Engineering, Kellerman Aerospace, Senior Propulsion Systems, United States Marine Corps, Special Operations, Equipment Recovery. Catherine read the sheet. She read it again. She asked Grace why Briggs hadn't mentioned any of this. Grace said she didn't know. She said it in the way that meant she did know, but thought Catherine should arrive at the conclusion herself. Catherine called Mason Holt at 9:14 that morning. He answered on the second ring. She introduced herself. He said he knew who she was. She asked him to come back to the carriage house. He said he could come that afternoon. She asked if 2 p.m. worked. He said it did. She asked if he needed to bring anything. He said just his tools. Then he paused. He said he might need to bring his daughter again. The school pickup wasn't until 3:30, but he could arrange something if it was a problem. Catherine said it wasn't a problem. She was there when he arrived. This time, there was no Briggs. There were no estate workers. It was Catherine and Grace, standing slightly to the left and behind in the way that good assistants do, and Mason, with a canvas tool roll under one arm and June beside him, Cog dangling from June's hand by one of its longer-eared end. Catherine was wearing the kind of clothes that signaled she had made an effort to seem like she hadn't. Pressed dark trousers, a shirt with its cuffs folded back. Mason shook her hand. June shook her hand too. Catherine crouched down to do it, which was the natural thing to do with a 6-year-old. She asked June's name. June told her. She asked Cog's name. June told her that too, and explained, briefly and seriously, that the shorter ear was because of pulling, and the stitching was her dad's work. Catherine looked up at Mason for a moment, with an expression he didn't comment on. They went into the carriage house. The next 3 hours Mason spent mostly on his back, mostly under the car, mostly quiet. He had brought his own flashlight. He had brought a set of specific tools, a torque wrench, a breaker bar, a series of sockets in sizes that the estate's tool cabinet didn't have, a can of penetrating oil he had mixed himself from a formula he had been adjusting for 7 years. He had brought a yellow legal pad that he used to make notes in a handwriting that was small and precise and slightly difficult to read. June sat on the wooden stool near the wall for the first hour. Then she fell asleep on Mason's canvas jacket. which he had folded into a pillow and set near the stool, with Cog under her chin. Catherine watched. She asked questions. Mason answered them in flat, specific sentences that neither invited nor dismissed further questions. He was not performing. He was not explaining more than was asked. He said what was true, and let the truth be what it was. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Mason stood up, wiped his hands on a red shop cloth, and told Catherine what the job was. The crank had seized due to dried oil varnish at the rear main bearing. The block was not damaged. He could free the crank using heat and penetrating compound and controlled leverage, working in stages over 2 days. The carburetor, he had confirmed, was not original. The original Hawley 715 was, in fact, hanging from a bracket on the back wall of the carriage house, dusty but intact. The wiring section near the firewall needed replacement on a 12-inch run. The fuel lines needed replacement throughout. The cooling system needed a flush and a new thermostat. He had found the correct replacement parts. Period appropriate, not reproduction. From 3 suppliers he knew, 1 in Alabama, 1 in Georgia, 1 in Ohio. He had already called them from the carriage house while Catherine was inside getting coffee. Total parts cost $912. Timeline: 11 days, working mornings and evenings around his day job, or 9 days if she wanted to pay for his time off the yard. Catherine said she would cover the days off the yard plus his time. She asked what rate was fair. He named a number. She agreed to it without negotiating. Carter Briggs arrived at 4:31 p.m. He had not been invited. He had heard through the estate's informal network that Catherine was in the carriage house with the maintenance worker. He had come to offer what he called perspective. He stood in the doorway, and he made his case. He said that Oliver Vance's firm had decades of experience. He said that the Shelby represented a piece of the Hargrove family's history, and that a mistake could be permanent, he said. And here his voice acquired a particular texture, the kind that sounds like concern, but functions like control. That Ms. Hargrove had been under considerable pressure recently, and that the board would not look favorably on a decision that appeared, from the outside, to be impulsive. The word impulsive did something in the room. Catherine looked at Briggs for a moment. Then she looked at Mason. Mason was rolling a socket back and forth in his palm, the way he did when he was listening to something he had decided not to respond to. June was awake now. She was sitting on the stool holding Cog, watching Carter Briggs with the focused, evaluative look of a child who has not yet learned that it is impolite to stare at someone who is saying something untrue. Catherine told Briggs she would think it over tonight and make a decision in the morning. Briggs nodded. He looked at Mason. He left. The room was quiet, not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of a room where a decision had already been made and was waiting for someone to say it aloud. She called Mason at 8:45 the next morning. She said yes. He started that afternoon. June was in school. He worked alone for 3 hours, applying the penetrating compound to the rear main bearing journal in the precise sequence he had decided on the previous evening. He did not rush. He had a sequence and he followed it. He drove to pick up June at 3:30. She had Cog in her backpack, because her teacher had a rule about stuffed animals on tables during work time. But Cog came out as soon as she was in the truck. She asked if the car was still sick. Mason said it was in the early part of getting better. She asked how long that part took. He said a couple of days. She said Cog's early part had taken a couple of days too. She said it with the authority of someone stating a relevant fact. That evening, he ate dinner with June and read to her from the book they were halfway through. Something involving a fox who kept getting lost and a badger who kept finding him. And after she was asleep, he went back to the carriage house for another 2 hours. On the third evening, he came home at 10:15 to find Cog on the floor just inside the bedroom door, which meant June had gotten up at some point and not fully made it back. He picked Cog up. He opened the door quietly, set Cog on the mattress beside June's hand, and stood there for a moment the way he always stood there. Not thinking anything in particular, just registering that she was breathing and that the room smelled like her shampoo and that nothing was wrong. He thought about Renata, not with the acute grief of the first year, which had been a different thing entirely. Not grief so much as a constant low-pressure system he had, lived inside. This was something quieter. He thought about what she would have made of the car. She had not cared about cars, mechanically, but she had cared about old things that still worked. She would have wanted to sit in it, windows down, radio loud, not going anywhere in particular. That was her specific preference for beautiful things. To use them, not to preserve them. He went back to the kitchen. He sat at the table for a few minutes. He did not make more coffee. He went to bed. He worked that way for 4 days, mornings and evenings. The penetrating compound did what it was supposed to do, in the time frame he had predicted, because he had done this before. Not this exact problem on this exact engine, but problems near enough that the difference was academic. On the 5th day, he attempted the first controlled rotation of the crank. It moved, not freely, not smoothly, but it moved. A quarter turn of the reluctant, grinding kind that means the metal is still negotiating its options. He stopped. Applied more compound. Waited. On the 6th day, he completed a full rotation. He wrote it down on the legal pad. The time was 6:44 in the morning. He wrote it down because writing things down was how he knew they were real. It was on the 7th day that Carter Briggs made his move. Mason didn't know this at the time. He was in the carriage house when it happened. He was replacing the fuel line on the passenger side, working slowly, because the original line brackets were fragile, and he did not want to crack one. What was happening? 2 floors up in the glass building downtown. Was this? Carter Briggs was sitting across a conference table from 2 board members, Harold Werner, who had been on the board since Catherine's father ran the company, and a woman named Sylvia Crane, who had joined 12 months ago and who had, from the beginning, been skeptical of Catherine's appointment. Briggs had called the meeting. He had characterized it as an informal check-in. He had brought a folder. Inside the folder were 3 things. The first was the Meridian Classic Works Assessment, which detailed the $300,000 estimate in professional, credential-laden language. The second was a photograph, taken without Mason's knowledge, from the carriage house doorway by one of the estate workers, showing Mason working on the Shelby. In the photograph, the original Holly carburetor was sitting on a workbench beside him, partially disassembled. Briggs described this as evidence of improper component handling. The third item was a document that Briggs had drafted himself, which he described as a summary of the risks of the current approach. He did not mention Mason's engineering credentials. He did not mention the Georgia Tech degree. He did not mention Kellerman Aerospace. He said that Miss Hargrove had made a significant decision without proper due diligence, that the asset was irreplaceable, and that the board had a fiduciary responsibility to consider whether the current restoration approach should be paused. Werner asked whether Catherine knew about this meeting. Briggs said he thought it was better to have the conversation first, so the board could approach Catherine with a unified perspective. Werner said nothing. He wrote something in the margin of his notepad that Briggs could not read. Sylvia Crane said she thought it was worth raising with Catherine. The meeting lasted 23 minutes. Catherine found out about it that evening from Grace, who had found out from Werner's assistant, who had a long memory for the informal channels of this particular building. She sat at her desk for 7 minutes after Grace left. Not thinking. The thinking had already been done. She was deciding what to do with what she knew. She opened the folder Grace had left. Not Briggs's folder. A different one. Grace had compiled it in the hours since the meeting. It contained Mason Holt's full employment history, his academic records, which Grace had found in a professional directory, a transcript of a paper Mason had co-authored at Kellerman Aerospace on metallic fatigue in turbine housings, peer-reviewed, cited 41 times, and at the back of the folder, something Grace had found that she had flagged with a single yellow sticky note. It was a letter of recommendation, written by a brigadier general named Adrian Walsh, for Mason Holt's application to the Kellerman Aerospace position 7 years ago. It described Mason's work in the field in terms that were careful and formal, and that nonetheless communicated something that careful, formal language rarely succeeds in communicating. The letter said that in 12 years of service, Walsh had encountered perhaps 4 men with Mason Holt's combination of technical intelligence, physical precision, and practical judgment under pressure. He said he would trust Holt with any problem that could be solved by human hands and a clear mind. Catherine read it twice. She closed the folder. She called Briggs and told him she wanted to see him in her office at 7 the next morning. Her voice was pleasant. Her voice was always pleasant. It was one of the things that had confused people into underestimating her. On the 10th day, Mason installed the carburetor. Not the Holly 652 that had been on the car, that had been removed and set aside. The original Holly 715, which had been hanging on the bracket on the back wall of the carriage house. He had rebuilt it over 2 evenings at home, at the kitchen table, with June watching from across the table, doing her school drawings. He had explained each component as he worked on it. June had asked questions with the specific practical curiosity of a child who has spent considerable time watching her father repair things. She had held Cog in the crook of her elbow and asked questions that were better than most adult questions. The carburetor went on the morning of the 10th day. The fuel lines had been replaced on days 7 and 8. The wiring section near the firewall had been replaced on day 9. The cooling system had been flushed, and the thermostat replaced on day 9 also. On the evening of the 10th day, Mason drove to the estate after June was in bed. Elijah Tate from the yard had come to sit with her, which he did sometimes, and he completed the final checks: oil pressure, battery connections, ignition timing, set by hand with a timing light he had brought from home. He sat in the driver's seat for 5 minutes. He did not start the car. He looked at the instruments. He looked at the steering wheel, which was original and unrestored, and felt exactly as it should feel under his hands. He thought about something he did not name. He drove home. The morning of the 11th day, Mason Holt arrived at the Hargrove estate at 7:50 a.m. with June in the passenger seat of the truck, Cog in June's lap, wearing his canvas jacket and carrying a cup of coffee in one hand. Catherine was already in the carriage house. Grace was with her. 2 members of the estate staff were present, different ones from the first day. Carter Briggs was not there. Carter Briggs had resigned that morning, 14 minutes before Catherine reached the office. He had cleared his desk overnight. He had left nothing behind except the Meridian Classic Works folder, which was on the corner of his desk, and a small yellow notepad on which he had written one line that HR would later describe in cautious language. He had also left behind, in his private email, an exchange with Oliver Vance at Meridian Classic Works that Grace had been given access to by the company's IT security team. That morning, at Catherine's request, following a formal review that had begun 4 days earlier, the exchange was 11 emails long. It detailed an arrangement. Meridian would provide an inflated assessment. Briggs would use the assessment to discourage Catherine from seeking alternatives. Meridian would be awarded the contract. Vance would redirect a consulting referral fee, not to the company, but to a personal account that bore Carter Briggs's initials and a routing number. That led through 2 shell structures to a financial instrument in Briggs's name. The paper trail was not complex. It was the kind of paper trail that exists when someone believes no one will look. Someone had looked. Mason set his coffee on the fender of a nearby vehicle. He asked Catherine if she was ready. She said yes. He asked if there was anyone else who should be here. She looked at him for a moment and said she thought that was up to him. He said he was fine with who was here. He went to the Shelby. He checked the oil level one more time. He checked the coolant level. He verified the fuel pressure gauge reading. He got in. June had come to stand beside the car. She was holding Cog by the long ear. She was watching her father the way she watched him when something important was happening, with the full, serious attention of a child who understands that some moments are worth remembering. Mason turned the key. The engine turned once, twice. It caught on the third revolution, not with violence, not with the explosive drama of a Hollywood reveal. It caught the way things catch when they have been prepared properly, with a low, settling rumble that built quickly into a sound that was recognizable as something specific and rare. Not just an old engine running. The specific voice of this specific engine, in this specific car, which had last spoken 19 years ago, and remembered exactly how. The sound had filled the carriage house. Nobody spoke. Grace was looking at the car with her hand over her mouth. The estate workers were looking at Mason. Catherine was looking at the floor near the front wheel, not because there was anything to see there, but because it was a place to look that wasn't in anyone's eyeline while she composed herself. June turned to Mason, who had gotten out of the car and was standing beside it with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. She said, "She's better now." 2 words, 3 words. She said it the way she had said it the morning after Cog's ear had been resewn, the morning after the Fox and Badger book's sad chapter, the morning after mornings that had required surviving in order to arrive. She said it with the certainty of a child who believes that things that are fixable get fixed. Catherine looked up. She walked to where June was standing. She crouched. Not a half crouch, not a polite gesture, but a full, down-to-eye level crouch, her knees on the carriage house floor, her hands briefly on the concrete to balance herself. She looked at June for a moment. She said she was sorry. June said it was okay. Catherine said it wasn't, actually. She said that she had made decisions based on information that turned out to be wrong, and that she hadn't asked the right questions first. And that your father did something no one else could do. And I didn't believe that fast enough. June considered this. She looked at Cog. She looked at Catherine. She said, "He usually does." Catherine offered Mason a position that afternoon, not a mechanic's role. A consulting role attached to the estate's vehicle collection, which was larger than most people knew. 11 cars in the carriage house, and 4 others in storage at a facility an hour outside the city, including a 1963 Ferrari 250 that had not run since 2008. The rate was 5 times what he made at the municipal yard. The hours were flexible around his daughter's school schedule. He could work from home on the analysis portions. She said she understood if he needed time. He said he appreciated it. He said he had a few questions. They were good questions, specific, about liability, about the sourcing relationships he would need to maintain, about what happened when the right call and the faster call weren't the same call. She answered them straight. No deflection. He said he would give her an answer by the end of the week. It was a Wednesday. He picked Frick from school at 3:30. She climbed into the truck and put Cog on the dashboard, which was where Cog rode when things had gone well. Mason asked about her day. She told him, in the particular detail that children produce when they are happy, about a game in the schoolyard, and a drawing she had made of a blue car with fire coming from the back. He asked what the fire was. She said it was just how the engine sounded. He pulled out of the school lot and onto the main road. The afternoon light was the kind that makes old neighborhoods look like they were built for something generous. They had dinner to make. There was a half-finished chapter about a lost fox and a patient badger waiting on the nightstand. June was telling him about the drawing, about the specific shade of blue she had used, about how she had given the driver a jacket. He was listening. He turned on the radio, low. He kept his hands at 10 and 2. June pulled Cog from the dashboard and held it against her chest and kept talking. The same easy, continuous flow that meant she was not worried about anything in particular. And neither, for this particular hour, on this particular road, with the engine running and the light going golden, was he.